Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center's Board of Directors, welcome to today's executive briefing on workforce development, labor supply, and related issues. I'm Peter Gold, Chair of GIC's College of Central Bankers and Vice Chair of GIC's Board of Directors. The College of Central Bankers now has 19 fellows from 12 countries, from England to Malaysia to Ireland to Israel. They are joined by 10 members of a distinguished advisory board, and I invite you to www.interdependence.org for more specific information on the college and the GIC. Today's executive briefing is part of the College of Central Bankers Institutional Alignment Project. This project examines the overarching question of whether national and international policy-making institutions are sufficiently equipped to address the impacts of high debt levels, digital currencies, unsupervised algorithmic trading, inequality, climate change, interest rates, and changing demographics. Working collaboratively, the College of Central Bankers is bringing these discussions to the global stage. I want to let you know that a program is in formation, and we're currently calling it Assuring That Economies Are Not a Casualty of War, the Roles of Central Bank in Wartime. We hope to have leaders and immediate former leaders of central banks discussing warring economies and what is the role of central banks. Further, Lisa Shaw, GIC's Vice Chair for Programs and the Program Committee Chair, and I are also working on a first ever live program in Canada. McGill University is our distinguished partner, so please stay tuned. Now to today's important program. Over the next hour, we will explore central banks' roles in labor force availability, development, and labor contributions to our economies. This is a changing environment of what seems to be spiraling inflation coupled with pandemic impacts and war. There is no one better to moderate this discussion on these topics than David Kotok, Chief Investment Officer of Cumberland Advisor, GIC board member, and a member of the College Advisory Board. Whether it's through traditional news sources, his blog, conferences, social media, GIC Camp, Kotok, or other means, David has a large global following which continually benefits from his thought leadership. So put on your seatbelts. With Danny and David, we are going to have actually wonderful exchange and learn a lot. I have no doubt about that. With that, David, I'm turning the virtual stage over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a lot of fun today because I'm able to moderate a session with a very dear longtime friend, a fishing buddy, which puts him in a unique status, an academic at Dartmouth, his professor there, and his experience at the Bank of England.
We lost him.
In monetary policy, and a skilled labor economist. So all that together identifies Danny Blanchflower, my friend, with whom we can chat. Danny, I would just want to make sure you can hear me.
You go in and out a little
are we
bit,
connected?
So, yeah, you're going out in and out a little bit, but it's okay.
I said nice words about
I heard them, thank you.
Okay, so we want to talk about a bunch of things today in an economy of time. Your forecasts for recession, and you've done some recent work, and you've got some data on major economies. You're in the pessimistic camp, I think. You see trouble coming. You're using mechanics that you've used before successfully to predict or to forecast, maybe we should start with that and then get into the shocks, energy shocks, war shocks, financial sanction shocks. And let's not leave this conversation until we also get into long COVID disability, temporary, partial, permanent disability shocks. And that's enough for the next 4 hours, but we only have about 45 minutes.
Exactly.
So why don't you take the beginning and give us an opening of the data that you and I spoke about, how you see it, maybe 5, 7, 10 minutes, and then we'll get into discussion.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm a labor economist, and I started out working on two things. In the early 1980s, I used to go and I met all the big names. I was a young PhD student. I met Olivier Blanchflower and Larry Summers and so on. And we used to meet on a Friday at 11:30 at the London School of Economics, and we'd go to the unemployment seminar because unemployment in Europe had risen dramatically. And I spent a lot of my life then thinking about unemployment and particularly its impact on wages. And the background to that is I wrote a book. I wrote this book. It's called The Wage Curve. And the wage curve is actually about modeling and understanding labor markets and understanding the forces that went through to impact wages. Prior to 2008, in fact, you could have gone and talked about the participation rate or the employment rate or the underemployment rate. Didn't really matter. The unemployment rate stood as a proxy for all of those things. To put it succinctly, and today that's true, if you go and look at the wage curve, which was about basically what impacts wages, and particularly it was about put the unemployment rate in a set of wage equations. So that turned out to be a pretty useful thing to do up to about 2008. Turns out a lot of what we're going to talk about suggests that post 2008, the unemployment rate is basically a worthless measure of what happens in the labor market. And anybody who focuses on it really doesn't understand what's going on in the labor market because it doesn't actually reflect the appropriate levels of slack. So in the background to this is that if you go and estimate the same wage equations that I estimated on every country in the world, pre-2008, the unemployment rate doesn't work. Well, what does work? The answer is other things. The underemployment rate, the employment rate, the participation rate. All of those things, it turns out, have not been reverted. And wages haven't been reverted either. And a big part of the story we're going to get to is why wage growth was so weak in the period 2015 to 2020. And we can have answers for that. So the first thing is that the levels of slack, it turns out, are much greater in economies around the world than people think. And the unemployment rate, in my judgment, is sort of irrelevant to what's going on. And just to have logic in people's minds, wages did not mean revert to levels before the unemployment rate did, and that's not very helpful. So the question, that's the first thing. The question is what's going on in labor markets right now? And a lot of my story is actually about, can you model unemployment? Can you think about what unemployment is? Work that out, work out what's happening to labor market slack, work out what's happened to various measures of it, and use that to tell you what's going on right now. So I essentially have spent a lot of the last year or two trying to build on work that I did in 2007 or so. And this is about whether a recession is coming. It's about forecasting a recession, forecasting what that recession is going to be like. And particularly with David and I are going to talk, I think, and it's a bit hard to work this out, but if there is a recession, I think there is, then how long does it last for and how deep is it? It turns out that there are pretty darn good predictors, because noting that economists and all the forecasters missed the Great Recession. But the reality is that if you'd have looked in the right places and in the right data, you could call it very readily. And it seems to me that any of the measures that you use to forecast the 2008 recession work extremely well today. And so the reality is if you run these unemployment equations and you can forecast what's going to happen to unemployment, these are really tough things to do. They're tough things to do in the equations that I do, which is usually some sort of disaggregated thing using state year data, not aggregate time series, trying to use that and forecast what's going on. So I wanted to I sent out a handout, just a little 4 pages, and it looks a little bit nasty, but there's a page here of a long set of data. And this is from a speech that I gave in April 2008. And I would say to you that it feels in my mind that that's really pretty much where we are, maybe April, May, June 2008. And this is a speech that I gave on April the 28th, 2008. And I said in that speech, by approximately 2007, the housing market problems have spilled over into real activity. The US seems to have moved into recession around the start of 2008. And so this is the data that I knew, that I had in front of me, and I knew in April 2008, you can see this is what I had. And it's quite clear in these data that if you look at what happened, you actually find that, and you can look at the data, you find that housing market quantities and prices fell first. Consumer confidence fell second. It moved through to real numbers. But it was clear from these numbers that actually by around April, May 2007, it was clear that recession was coming. So I can talk more about that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But basically, if you go back, you can absolutely see in these data that these data predict recession. Subsequent work we've done on these kind of variables, these sort of qualitative variables, and there's a set of papers, and I can talk about several of them we've worked on. They're available. You can click on them and get them. Essentially, what these consumer expectations variables do around the world, in Europe, in the UK, and in the United States, is they predict recessions. And so consumer expectations, if you use the University of Michigan or the Conference Board, they call all 6 of the last 6 recessions between 6 and 18 months early. If you wait for the NBER to call it, you're going to wait a year after it happened. So these data call it 6 to 18 months ahead in every case. And they also don't call a recession wrongly. So the story is that expectations data turn out to be highly predictive of recessions. And it turns out that if you look at the data that's in our various papers now, we've seen a collapse in consumer expectations around the world. I'm going to stop in a sec. The consumer expectations have collapsed around the world. And I'm very struck in the United States by how little discussion there is about what's going on in the rest of the world. So I was just going to show a couple of things, and David, I'll come back to you. But if you just quickly look at the charts. So I've just presented you four charts there. And these essentially are all in recession territory. And the part of the discussion I'm interested in is you have a discussion in the Fed and the Bank of England saying that you have to raise rates, but there's also a discussion going on in the ECB and the Bank of Japan saying you don't need to, and they're faced by the same things. So let's just look at what we've got here. So there's a set of data, so I've worked a lot on these kinds of data. The first chart is about financial expectations in the Euro area. Well, that, it turns out, especially in the last 2 months, has collapsed. It collapsed. It's now well below the level that it was in 2007 and 8. It's now below where it was in March 2020 when COVID hit. And you can do that across 28 countries and across all the countries of the European Union. This is true. And at the same time, 12 European countries already have actually, well, 12 OECD countries, I think it is now, already have negative GDP growth in Q1. So the first one is just financial expectations. What do you think is going to happen to expectations over the next 12 months? And these turns out to be predictive. Second thing, if you go to the Japanese consumer confidence measure, that's fallen. It's not obviously not as much as in 2020, but it's comparable to it's declining, and the Japanese central bank have taken note. The third chart is a chart for the UK, close to my home, and I use these data from 2007, along with things like the Bank of England agent scores. So the GfK UK Consumer Confidence Index collapsed in May to the lowest level it's ever been since 1974, below the record previously set in July 2008. And this consumer confidence data predicts recession. And then finally, the University of Michigan, and you can do the same thing with Conference Board measures. The University of Michigan index has been collapsing, continues to collapse. And then finally, instead of papers, I have data across the 8 biggest states in the United States. And basically, you can show that by April, May 2021, that looked much like it looked in April 2007. So I'm going to move on from here, but these, I have all sorts of econometric equations and other things that essentially show you, these enter into unemployment equations. These predict unemployment. The levels that they're at are scary. And I essentially think that now it's pretty hard to think other than the US and Japan and Europe and the UK are basically already all in recession. Oh, and the last thing, and of course, the downward revisions come at these turning points. And France this week saw a downward revision from 0 to -2. That's it. That's 7 minutes.
Danny, you did well. Thank you. You've set the stage for the discussion.
Right.
So look at where we are in the US. Housing turning down. Lumber prices, which everybody was all excited about, I call them the inflationistas, were all out of control.
Yeah.
They're back to where they were before they started.
Right.
And we have this political dialogue, and we have the Federal Reserve in the United States talking about inflation, 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 and pointing to the unemployment rate, which you yourself have just identified is a weak indicator. Talk about the employment population ratio, the participation rate, the things that people on this call can look at instead of the unemployment rate to see where things are.
Right. So initially I started work on the underemployment rate. And it turns out there's a paper by David Bell and myself, which basically shows you that between 2008 and 2015 or so, the underemployment rate, which is basically the workers get less hours than they would like. And that turns out to enter wage equation. It replaces the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate doesn't enter. But it turns out in the last 3 or 4 years, that doesn't really move that much. So what you end up, and I have various students working on this and papers coming, but essentially, if you want to understand wage pressure, today what enters a wage equation is the employment rate or the participation rate. The choice you have, you can choose between the two of them. It turns out that the employment rate dominates. And the way for people to think of this, if you argue the labor market's tight, well, you're not looking at the world. The employment rate today is a percentage point below where it was in 2020. It's 2.5 percentage points below where it was in 2008, and nearly 5 percentage points below where it was in 2000. And I was struck by a statement which sort of sums things up this week by a Fed governor, which says that there are underlying factors that explain why participation is depressed, including early retirements and individual choices associated with COVID concerns. Well, very interesting. Completely wrong, because the reason it's wrong is that every other country in the world has had the same exact things. Demographics the same, technology the same, COVID responses, and no other country in the world, Canada, the UK, Germany, Italy, Greece, Britain, Japan, none of them have had this declining employment rate. There's something very special in the United States about it. You have a choice between the employment rate, David, and the participation rate. Just so people understand, the employment rate turns out to be a little better, just so everyone gets it. The employment rate is just E over population, and the participation rate is E plus U over population, right? But the U bit is a bit strange. So actually it turns out there's a horse race between the employment rate and the participation rate. Turns out the employment rate is kind of better because it's got this messed up thing called a U on the top of the participation rate, but it's a pretty good indicator. So I think the answer is that there's much more slack in the labor market than the Fed and other people think. I think they have very little understanding of what's going on in the labor market. I mean, example, if you go to an underemployment rate, that means the pressure, instead of coming from outside the labor market, outside people you don't know, it turns out now that wage pressure comes from people you do know. It's by people within the organization. You have as many hours as you'd like. This person over here would like more hours, that keeps your pay down. So the labor market has completely transformed and changed itself. And I think that I mean, when you read things like the speech by Waller this week, I thought it was from planet Mars. I don't think it showed any understanding of what the labor market was actually doing. It was just based on 5 times series observations and guessing. David.
So if you examine Waller's speech, Fed Governor Waller's speech, and you then compare it with Jim Bullard's most recent remarks, which says we're going to go back down to rates and lower than where we were before. And Loretta Mester, who articulately talked about a 2% or so neutral rate. We have 3 different members of the FOMC sending 3 different messages in an economy of time, in an accordion of time. And if one looks at your old stomping ground, the Bank of England, you get a mixed message too. One member of the Bank of England says, don't look at us, we're not responsible for any of this.
Well, I think,
sort us through
right.
this central bank diverse policy in Japan,
right.
Kuroda, I'm not doing anything till I retire.
Right.
I mean, how do we make a sense out of all
I think the first thing that I'm struck by, so we start out with 4 central banks. 2 central banks say, here we face with collapsing consumer confidence, rising inflation, we're going to raise rates. The other 2 saying we're facing exactly the same thing, and we're not going to raise rates. So the first thing I'm very struck by is groupthink. I mean, we have all the members of the Fed saying the same thing. We have all the members of the Bank of England saying the same thing. That what we've got to do is raise rates. But the reality, and then you have speeches saying, sort of guessing speeches and speeches of wishful thinking, saying things like, oh, the inflation rate's going to return to something. We know what's coming. Well, in this world, one thing is absolutely clear, you don't know. And I don't know at all. I think that the outcomes are really very uncertain. It strikes you very much about forecasting. Forecasters, what does Galbraith say famously? Economic forecasters make astrologers look good. So I think the answer is there's great uncertainty here. And basically prognosticating right now is not the right thing to do. I mean, David Kotok has been very good on this. Essentially what you should say is, here's 5 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, inflation doesn't go back to a lower number. Scenario 2, it goes negative. I'll talk about that in a sec. Scenario 3, COVID comes back. Scenario 4, there's a long COVID and people's permanent changes in behavior happen. So we don't know the answer to that. I mean, if you look at Waller's speech, he has no data. There's no past data to go on. This is just sort of making things up on the back of an envelope. So we don't really know. So the right thing to say is, here's a set of scenarios. We can't choose which scenario it is. I got into a conversation with Greg Ip the other day, who wrote a column saying that, oh, I think inflation is going to return to 4%. So I sent him the greatest chart on earth, which is the Bank of England produces an inflation chart for the UK from the year 1210. And if you look at this chart, I mean, this is evidence. You could say whether we believe it or not. But I said to him, well, the evidence is actually in any event, in any occasion in the last 810 years, when inflation got anywhere near 10, the likelihood is that it's going to go to -4. And I'm not saying I think it is going to go to -4, but I think -4 is just as plausible as 4, because you don't know. So I think what's happened is people's degree of certainty is much too high. And if you go to the data that I've talked about, these data have predicted 6 of the last 6 recessions. Now, it's true that labor market data tend to accompany it, and there's a sort of split here. But everything else that people say, all of the 3 people that you just talked about are just guessing. There's nothing more than guessing. It's just, I guess this, I guess 2, I guess inflation is going to do this. Boom, sorry, they're guessing.
So a question for you, and it's a question which we can incorporate into this discussion. We have listeners, and they will listen again with the replay and be able to have your charts in front of them if they didn't get them in the beginning. And they are investors, some policymakers, and they are business people. They have to allocate. They listen to the macro, Danny, but they have to now go and put it into work in their business, in their personal lives, in their outlooks for economic transactions. They're market agents, each of them. What would you say to them if they said, Professor, I got it, I'm with you, what do I do?
Well, I think the answer is
capital expenditure.
No, that's
how do I project?
Yeah. Well, I think you protect and cover yourself to the downside. But essentially what I'm saying here, which in a sense builds on what you said, listening to the audience, what these papers tell you, and when you look at consumer confidence, my view is that what you do is you go and talk to businesses and people. So you go and look at the PMIs. You ask businesses, what do you think's going on? And you ask people, what do you think's going on? It turns out in the papers that I've worked on, those people do a better job at telling you what's coming than economic forecasters do. So if you say, what do you think is going to happen to unemployment over the next 12 months? You ask firms that, you say, what do you think is going to happen to employment? Turns out that's all you need to look to. So you talk to your customers, you talk to firms. Those tell you, and then particularly in the instance of, say, 2008, these indices, when you ask what's going to happen to unemployment, well, 12 months later it rose. So it was predictive. So it turns out that this, what I call the economics of walking about, is predictive. And I'm sort of saying, well, you listen to your customers, you listen to the people that you work to. You don't listen to economic forecasters. You don't listen to failed central bankers, because central bankers didn't forecast the Great Recession. They also didn't forecast what happened to the labor market from 2015 to 18. They thought we were at full employment. As the unemployment rate came down, wage growth remained flat. They got that wrong. So I think what this stuff tells you is listen to people, go with your instincts. And if people say there's going to be a downturn, which is what they're saying, there's going to be a downturn. And for whatever a central bank says that, it's all going to be fine, we can do this, that, and the other, and there'll be a soft landing. Well, there's no evidence to support that. There's little evidence to support anything. But if anything, you should probably go with the patterns across the world.
So let's transfer to how the business person, the investor, the fiduciary, the person who has to make the market decision one at a time, which we subsequently see a few months from now in macro data. And they're looking at central banks raising rates. Whether we agree with them or not, this Fed is on a track to take at least 2 to 3 hikes of 50 basis points before it gets to some pause. We did in other places. What's the impact, in your opinion, of taking those rates up 150 or 200 basis points?
Well, right. I mean, in a sense, the work has been done because the market has priced in those rate rises. My view was at the last press conference where Powell was talking about these rate rises, and all the journalists were saying, is it really going to be 75? And I think on Bloomberg directly afterwards, I said, well, there were 2 questions they should have asked him. The first was, what would it take for you not to raise rates? And second, what would it take for you to cut rates? And so I think that's the reality. So the question is, if you think, I just don't know what's coming, but why would everybody know the answer? They don't know the answer at all. That was the right question to ask. So the question, it seems to me, is the market is sort of with me in many senses. That the market is waiting, in a sense, for bad news from financial markets on treasuries or spreads or something. But I think we're increasingly seeing bad things. You mentioned lumber prices. I also always like my favorite, the Baltic Dry. The Baltic Dry is down 30% in a week. Container shipping prices are down markedly. So I think the answer is that, we see, some of what's driven what's going on is Netflix showed the big decline in Netflix subscriptions, and then Walmart and so on, Walmart and Target's data. So I think the answer is that the talk of rate rises just gives them a thought about the what's coming from the downside. And in some sense, for investors, I think that tells you about the bottom. It's about when these days, in a sense, you're praying for bad things, but that's when as soon as the Fed starts to realize it's on the wrong track. Can I say one last thing, Dave, just quickly? So the thing that people don't seem to have understood is that, Waller thinks that raising rates to 27% is costless. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So the question is, if you say I've got to control inflation, what's the cost of doing that? And so I gave this paper for the Boston Fed for a whole series of Fed governors. And I went and tried to think about, so what's the consequence? What's the consequence of doing this to solve inflation? Turns out a 1 percentage point rise in unemployment lowers well-being 5 times more than a 1 percentage point rise in inflation. So it's not like you just can solve inflation. It doesn't have any costs. It turns out Waller's hoping that you can reduce inflation a lot, but it has no effects on the real economy, which I don't understand. There you
go. We're getting questions.
Good.
I'm trying to incorporate them together. Before we've got about 20 minutes left, and then we have to go back to Peter. And the conversation is wonderful because you're sitting on a central bank board and you
Right.
are able to speak freely, and
Right.
you don't have constraints. So let's hit two more points before we get to long COVID. Point: balance sheet size versus interest rate policy. And can you either talk to balance sheet size as
Right.
related to inflation, or I can't find qualified pay. Balance sheet is responsible for inflation, but there's a
Right.
debate about that. So
Right.
point one, talk about balance sheet size, because in the US, we're shrinking it, whether we like it or not.
Right. Which is what's driving down
And
the stock
let's
market.
make that,
Right.
okay. So, and
Let me
which
go
I
with
think
that.
before we get to long COVID and disability. All right, let's do balance sheet size first.
Right.
Go.
Well, I take the view that we really don't know. I mean, obviously, I was one of these people who voted for QE very early on. And I remember the conversation at the bank. We really had no clue about the scale. For example, I mean, I remember thinking, well, if you think the unit of observation we have is a 25% cut in interest rates, 25 bit cut, what's that? What's the equivalent of that in QE terms? And that took a long time to think about. And then you said, well, the question is, well, what's the impact of this thing? Is it the change in the balance sheet? So, you do 50 billion a month. Is that the thing that's driving what happens in the market? Is the level of the balance sheet driving? The answer to that is, whatever it is now, it's 14 years later. We haven't a clue. We had no clue about, I mean, I remember the conversation. We had no clue how to do it, what to do, what its effects would be. And I do remember the only conversation we had was about, well, when you have to sort of slow the thing, what are you going to do? Are you going to raise interest rates first, or are you going to tighten? And we didn't have a clue. The economics was unclear. So I think that's an obvious issue I mean, people talk about we're going to do it. The answer is just like we did with QE. It's like, how do you tell the taste of chocolate ice cream? You don't know till you taste it. So I think the answer there is that we really don't know. This is in a great world of uncertainty. And I'm just struck again, go back to the Bank of England. The conversation at the Bank of England was the communication was so terrible, but they're all saying the same thing. And there's a whole series of alternative views just as plausible. And so I think the very fact that they're all singing from the same hymn book, suggests that, the credibility of the central bank is under question, because they're clearly just making it up.
So in the United States, we're raising the policy interest rate. The market has front run that and put the
Right.
yield curve up.
Right.
And we're shrinking the balance sheet at the same time. It's hard enough to have a central bank get one thing right at one time,
Right.
let alone two.
Right. And so the question is, I mean, Waller thinks that it's all going to be benign and wonderful, and there will be no real consequences in the labor market or the product market. Well, he can say that because there's no data to tell him otherwise, but there's also no data to support his case either. So the answer is that potentially you do that, and then you get effects with lags. And my suspicion is because of what's happened to consumer confidence, what's happened to other things. I mean, we're seeing slowing, just as we saw in 2006, we're seeing considerable slowing in house building and purchases and so on. So I think the answer is that the danger here is you get overtaken by the data, and you ask what should people be watching for. I'm mindful that Powell should answer the question, what would it cause you to stop? He might have said a 5% drop in the Dow on a day. He might have said, there's a set of things, a dropping of the PMI, some set of things that would give them a sense of pause, but perhaps would make people on the Fed think that there were multiple opinions. And I tell you a quick story. I was always losing 1 to 8 when I was at the bank from October 2007. And in June 2008, the Prime Minister called me up and he said, Danny, you're losing 8 to 1 every time. But just so you know, there aren't 8 opinions. There's your opinion and there's theirs. And just because there are 9 people who vote together, they may well just, and he said to me, I think you're right. But there's a good example. How can you possibly, if you think of the logic, two central banks saying something completely different, every single member of the Fed, every single member of the Bank of England saying the same thing, and my bet is they're all wrong.
So I'm honored now because I'm actually interviewing the John Stuart Mill of central bankers. Marvelous. Let me get to the that's who you just demonstrated it. So let me get to the second part before we move to long COVID and how we deal with this disability cohort in the labor force. So one more question. You just painted a picture of 4 central banks, 4 currencies, 2 policies going in one direction, 2 policies in the other direction. And therefore, what you've outlined is how it's the currency foreign exchange ratio that has to be the buffer. And we've seen it in dollar euro, dollar yen.
Absolutely.
Talk about the shock from the currency buffer and its second derivative, because that's going to neutralize what these folks are trying to do. Say a few words about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm always mindful of the currency. I went to the Bank of England, paid in UK pounds, and I talked the pound down hugely. And by the time I left, my pay was worth a quarter less than when I arrived. So I'm not a good guy to talk about the currency. But obviously, in a way, the bets have got to be, I mean, there are 2 central banks who are essentially following Blanchflower. There's 2 central banks who are following Waller. And the exchange rates are going to be a big deal. And the question is, which of the markets are going to believe? And I think as the downside news comes, you're going to see people certainly shorting the pound. These currencies are a really big deal. And I think you're going to see great volatility. And certainly, I mean, another story, we were given 25 billion pounds in foreign exchange reserves, if needed, to try and protect the currency. And we worked out very quickly that there's $1 trillion a day in exchange in London on the foreign exchange markets, and central banks have no ability at all to intervene in those exchange markets in a real sense. So I think the currencies are a really big issue, and I certainly would be short in the pound.
If you're a small business, an independent business in the United States, if you're an investor, you have very limited capacity. If you're a very large international, multinational company, you can use cross-currency interest rate swaps. You can use the derivatives. The derivative size is what, 800 trillion now, but you have to deal with banks and you have to be a player in that very small club. What about the rest of us?
Well, the rest of us are going to struggle. I mean, so I've written a lot about actually how the importance of capital constraints. And you certainly would think, so I've written a lot about, which groups of people can get access to capital, certainly evidence that minorities struggle to get access to it. But you might think, going back to 2008, when the capital markets froze up, that's what generated a decline in output, right? So think about, why did the Baltic Dry collapse? Because people weren't prepared to basically pay for international trade. So I think the likelihood that essentially financing swallows up or becomes hard to come by, is going to particularly impact marginal folks and small firms. And I'm expecting to see that having starting to see a big impact on survival of these small firms in this market. And particularly we've seen in other countries, in many places like Germany and France, they were protected hugely from COVID. And we didn't see a big rise in the unemployment rate. The protection there, countries that had protection and unions and so on, did particularly well. Countries without that kind of protection, exposed to foreign trade as well, were the ones that were weak. So protective institutions in Europe probably helped, David. And then we want to go to COVID.
So here we are. We've talked about central bank policies in the 4 major central banks. We've talked about the differences between them. We've talked about the currency adjustment. We've talked about interest rates going up. We've talked about versus other metrics, which may reveal more than the traditional unemployment rate. And we've talked about certainty in policy. And we haven't mentioned this cohort of disabled people that is now added to the labor force above the baseline trajectories of the last half century. Say a little bit about how you deal with these constituencies of temporary, partial, or permanent disabilities, and how you can find ways to put them, one, in your forecasts, how they are impacting sentiment, that's number two, and number three, the economic impact of not enough people to fill the jobs. That's another 4-hour lecture. You've got 10 minutes.
I think the first thing that I would say, let's just start us off, David. So the reason the employment rate is a better indicator of what's gone on is because it's employment over population. Who's left? And we'll call them not in the labor force or out of the labor force. So one of the big things we've seen is that these out of the labor force people were actually very vulnerable. So what you saw, and one of the big stories, is the declining participation rate of prime age, less educated men especially. And so the period from 2000, essentially these folks were the ones who were left behind. And a lot of the political problems you might think in the United States and elsewhere have to do with the fact of these people were neither employed nor unemployed, we'll call them disabled. But so those people, in a sense, over the last decade or so have been vulnerable. Those vulnerable people were especially likely to get COVID. They were vulnerable in a number of ways because they didn't have access to healthcare. Partly if you're out of the labor force and you're not old, or particularly in rural parts of America, you didn't have access to healthcare. You became vulnerable. And so that story, the decline in the employment population rate, has to do with all those people who went to disability before. And we don't really know what they were doing. Certainly around the world, those people voted for populist political parties. There's some evidence of that. So now we get ourselves to COVID. And COVID, essentially, I have a great friend of mine, Peter White, who's one of the world's experts on chronic fatigue syndrome and ME. And this is sort of yuppie flu, which is almost exactly the same as what the consequences are of this thing called long COVID. So long COVID is about, COVID does things, especially for those who were particularly vulnerable, who were on ventilators, all of that stuff gives people lung effects, brain effects, and then there's obviously the emotional part to it too. But it appears that the evidence on that is substantial. So think about an underemployed person. You would like to be able to work more hours. You can't get it because your employer doesn't offer it. But in fact, your income is lower because you work less hours. Well, COVID could be that you can't work at all. COVID could be that you're so tired. I mean, Stephen Colbert talks about, he's got long COVID and he struggles to be able to do the work that and David's got examples of that. So long COVID potentially is a highly debilitating disease. Well, outcome anyway. So multiple ME, for example, the treatments of that, relatively few of them, they involve, there's huge controversy around the world as well, but they involve basically psychotherapy and they involve physical therapy. And this turns out to going to have a major effect. So David and I shared a paper this morning, which so people are trying to think about the scale of this, and Britain's pretty good at it. The estimates today are that we've probably got between 5 and 9 million people in the United States now who've got long COVID. We don't know how it was going to go away, but if we look at chronic fatigue syndrome, they do not appear to have a cure to it. It appears to be long lasting. And their estimate today, and we'll set it up, David's a great expert on this, but the estimate today, and this is from a paper by Mirren, Dimmock, and Jason in Fatigue, Biomedicine, Health and Behavior out today. And they estimate, I'll read it to you, we estimate total prevalence of this, the long COVID, could rise between 5 and 9 million. This would incur an annual US economic impact of 149 to 362 billion in medical expenses and lost income, exclusive of other costs such as disability benefits, social services, and lost wages of caretakers. So this is going to be a major, looks like a major cost, and it's going to have a major impact on labor supply. David, and you should talk, David, because you're a great expert on this.
Well, you just gave data that you and I exchanged in the last 24 hours. And the UK is 67 million people.
Yep.
ONS has good information. The ONS data I saw in last month breaks long COVID down by variant and essentially says 8 to 9% of the people, regardless of the variant, will get long COVID.
For which we don't really have treatment. I mean, if we look at ME and CTF, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Right. So, and now if you take the numbers you just recited and translate them to a population of 335 million people, you would say, okay, back of the envelope, let's take what Danny just read off, multiply by 5.
Well, this was US though, but these numbers were in US.
So the GAO study, which was March 2nd, said 8 million low, 23 million.
Yep, it's higher estimates, I agree.
High, somewhere in between. Yeah, so my point for the purposes, we've only got a couple minutes left in our webinar. For the purposes of conceptualizing central bank policy, labor impact on inflation, productivity, whatever the size millions you want, this is big. And once we agree that it's big, then how do you see 3-4 minutes left or so? How do you see the next 12 months with the best discussed for the 45 minutes?
I mean, I think in a sense, if I play this role, which is that, sorry, I'll just get rid of it. If I play the role of the devil's advocate here, and every time say, well, it's really very uncertain, and I really don't know.
Well, I have to ask you. I have to ask you. Was that Haldane calling you on the phone?
He's got a trouble at the moment. He's got all his workers on strike. Just so you know, his new job, and he's not happy because they're all trying to join.
I cut you off, but I
know you did. Oh, I forgot what I was saying. I cut you off
because I couldn't
resist.
What I was saying.
Please. No, I think that it's the reality is that this is a very uncertain world. So go back to what you've just said. So all these central bankers are saying, well, the Fed's going to do this, this, and this, and in 3 years' time they'll be, well, okay. So what's the past history of long COVID? What do you know about that? Well, obviously a benefit in some sense, you might think. Remote working might well actually be a real big help to those in long COVID who are too tired to get on the train and commute and all of that stuff. So we don't know that. But I think one of the things I always ask when I think of what people are saying, and I think what Fed officials are saying, is the following. So what long-term changes in behavior are you assuming is going to occur? Your answer is none. But if 10% of the population has got long COVID and they don't want to do X and Y, the answer is the world is very uncertain. And just go back, all Fed members, all MPC members saying the same thing. No changes in long-run behavior. Long COVID doesn't exist, and all will be fine. Well, that's unadulterated nonsense. And Peter's appeared.
Yes.
Peter, let me give Danny one more, and then I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, I've got a question for both of you. So you go ahead.
All right, go ahead. We'll turn it over to you. You moderate the rest, Peter. And
fantastic discussion. Absolutely great. I have a question for both of you. And it's this. And I'm going to ask it in a micro way and then in a macro way. So in the micro way, I used to pay $60 a week for gas. Now I'm paying $90. I used to go to the grocery store and pay $125. Now I'm paying $170. Plus the number of graham crackers in the box are far less. And I'm paying more for them.
Okay.
That's the micro. That's the micro. So the macro is, as a non-economist, but one who took a few courses in economics, both macro and micro, and having the privilege of interacting with people like you, Danny, and you, David, I've learned a little bit over the years. And the macro way of asking this question is economies. What do we want from them? On the one hand, we want economies to provide opportunity for workers, for our labor supply. but there's a responsibility to labor. It's to get itself to be available, to actually work, have the right amount of skills to do that match. Where do we stand in the United States and the world in that balance? How well are economies actually performing given today what we're looking at, whether we look at it as spiraling inflation, whether we look at the pandemic, long COVID, how is our economy doing in that balancing? Is it performing the way we want it to perform historically, and as you as experts would expect from it?
Can I go first quickly? I mean, the first thing I think is one thing we've really learned is that work makes people happy. Absence of work makes them unhappy. So every other country in the world since 2000 has performed much better, pretty darn much, than the United States has, because it's seen a collapse in its employment rate. So we have to think about why that might be. But I always try and counter the question that you asked me, which I always think people don't understand what inflation is. So if prices are 100 in year 0 and they rise to 110 in year 1, inflation's 10%. In year 2, it remains at 110. The answer is that yes, prices are 10% higher than they were in year 0, but inflation's 0. So the question is, what's coming? And we know with inflation generally that the base effects, the large base effects, drop out. So the question is, unless we keep seeing repeated shocks, that inflation is going to fall. Historically, just in the 800 years of data, basically inflation spikes. It spikes up, and then what do people do? They collapse their confidence, they stop buying things, they move to buying essential goods, and inflation plummets. So generally, if you're a policymaker, once-off changes in prices, you should ignore. I mean, essentially my decision as a central banker was, what's the effect, what's inflation going to be in 2 years' time? If inflation in 2 years' time is going to be unchanged by this event, I shouldn't change. And that's the right way to think. And many central bankers around the world are thinking, this is a once-off spike in oil prices. Even if oil prices remain at 120, and they remain at 120 going forward, inflation's 0. David.
So let me say 2 things to Peter's question. I totally agree with Danny on the view, and I would just add 2 things, Peter. If graham crackers are too expensive for you, substitute rice crackers.
Absolutely.
And the best cure for a high price is a high price. Now, you have to have functioning markets. You have to have economies that are permitted to make the adjustment process. And if you impede the adjustment process, which central bankers, policymakers, politicians can do, they make it worse.
Absolutely.
The second thing I would add is just a little forecast of my own. You outlined, Peter, the gasoline price, the oil price, the energy price shock. And in the United States, rough back of the envelope, every penny a gallon amounts to about 1.8 billion annualized after-tax non-deductible consumption tax on 335 million Americans. That's an approximate number, but it's pretty close. Yep. If you're in New York and you go to work on the subway, that cost may be lower than if you're in Montana and have to drive 100 miles each way, but that's roughly what it is on the US economy. So if you say the US economy, because of the energy shock, which was not monetary policy, bankers don't know how to drill for oil, find it, refine it. They don't know how to do it. So you say, okay, we're having a shock roughly of a 300 billion tax on the United States. 2 things. That size shock is monumental, fast, and it also cures itself over time.
Absolutely.
And then it becomes a tax cut down the road and disinflationary down the road.
That's why.
And those are causes for.
Right. Can I say one? Can I say one other
And
thing?
that's a cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I say one other thing to add to that?
Go ahead.
And people are worried
Dan.
about a so-called wage price spiral. And I remember they were worried about a wage price spiral in 2008, which never happened. And they were worried about it in every single year through to 2020. The reality is that when we had oil price shocks in the 70s, where most of these bankers seemed to have stuck their heads into, what we'd seen were Paris riots in 1968. And we saw a rise in union membership around the world between 1968 and 1979. And so union power was extremely high, and they managed to negotiate in the US COLA clauses in contracts. In Britain, there were 3-day weeks and strikes and so on. Well, since then, we've had globalization. We've had globalization, firms opposing union power. Workers care a lot about keeping their jobs, about flexibility. And they're mindful of the things that David talked about, and that long COVID's here and they're grateful to have a job and so on. So the belief that there's any chance of a wage price spiral, in my judgment, is zero.
I see.
Peter,
So
let's give it back to you for the close.
Okay, thank you. Just before I do that, one other really quick question, 1 second answers each. Of soft landing, hard landing, crash, Danny, A, B, or C?
Crash.
David?
Hard and then very robust recovery after.
And just go back. So robust recoveries do occur. I mean, if you look in the UK, what happened was robust recovery was coming. If you leave an economy to adjust, it will do it itself. What happened around the world is governments went in and imposed austerity and stopped the natural bounce back from recessions. So once you start on the bounce back, the government's got to get out of the way. The last thing it should be doing was austerity. But yeah, there'd be a crash and there'd be a very rapid bounce back, because that's what economies do. For the same kind of reason David talked about. Now is the bottom. Now's the time to buy, right? Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you both. But David, Danny, thank you for this fascinating and lively discussion.
Get them going.
Greatly appreciated. We hope you'll each be able to join us for a GIC program again soon.
Of course.
As a reminder, before we close, a replay of today's executive briefing will be available on the GIC's website, I hope a little later today. We are also very excited to announce our initiative Long COVID Research, Policy, and Economic Impact Series in partnership with Solve Long COVID will continue on Tuesday, June 7th. We will focus on the impact of long COVID on children, and we'll be joined by Emily Taylor, Vice President of Advocacy and Community Relations at Solve ME, as well as other Solve and GIC community members. A particular thanks again to David Kotok for his not only moderating today, but his general gift in funding and supporting our long COVID program series following on the heels of the pandemic series. Thank you, David. By the way, registration is now available for all our active programs on our sites, including our long COVID program coming up. To find the video replays, explore GIC membership, learn more about the College of Central Bankers, or donate, so please think about doing that. Please visit our website at www.interdependence.org. As we conclude today, I'd like to thank our fantastic staff under Jill's leadership for their indispensable help with this production. We also encourage you to take 30 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us, and we appreciate your letting us know how we can improve our program. Thank you for attending. Have a great day. Be well. Thank you.